Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to become literary detectives. Have you ever read a classic story and felt like, there was some sort of secret conversation happening right beneath the surface? Well, there usually is. To truly understand a piece of literature, we have to look behind the text and uncover the hidden worlds that shaped it. We're going to build a toolkit for doing exactly that, and then we're going to apply it to two incredible but vastly different stories.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll define exactly what literary context is, and then we'll build out a context detectives checklist. From there, we'll analyze Chekhov's rural Russia, followed by London's freezing Arctic. Finally, we'll compare the two stories and leave you with a quick discussion guide.
Section 1. What is literary context? The invisible forces shaping every story.
So, simply put, stories just don't exist in a vacuum. They're totally molded by outside forces. And the very first crucial piece of our detective puzzle is biographical context. This basically answers the question, who is the actual person behind the pen? We need to look at how an author's personal life, their day job, their family history, and their own lived experiences directly influence the narrative and the themes they choose to explore. An author generally writes what they know, or at least they write through the lens of their own life.
Next up, we have historical context. Now, this is all about knowing what was happening out there in the broader world when a story was actually penned. Was there a major war going on? An economic crash? Maybe a sweeping new law just passed? The specific political events, economic conditions, and the general time period totally anchor a text. Understanding this history often unlocks the deeper, sometimes hidden meaning or even the urgent warning an author was trying to convey. Finally, we have to look at sociocultural context. If historical context is the timeline, sociocultural context is basically the rules of the game that the characters are forced to play by. This involves the societal norms, cultural values, class structures, and belief systems of the society depicted in the story. It tells us exactly who has power, who doesn't, and what that specific society considers to be right or wrong.
Section 2. The Context Detectives Checklist. Tools for your literary investigation.
Now that we understand the core theory here, how do we actually go out and find this information? Well, it's a systematic investigation, and it starts with 3 really concrete steps that you should take before you even finish the first chapter. Step 1. Look up the author. Where did they grow up? What did they do for a living? Step 2. Check the publication year. What major global or national events were dominating the headlines back then? And step 3, as you read, actively analyze the text for those social class dynamics and cultural norms that are shaping the character's choices.
To make this even easier, you can consider this your ultimate reading comprehension checklist. Try asking yourself these exact questions. What was the author's primary profession or personal struggle? Did any major laws pass right before the book came out? Within the story itself, who holds the power? Who is pushed to the margins or completely ignored? And finally, is the author writing this to support the current social norms, or are they trying to challenge them? Keep these questions in your back pocket as we open up our very first case file.
Section 3. Analyzing Chekhov's rural Russia, exploring a day in the country.
Now, what's really interesting here is how perfectly our methodology applies to this short story published in May 1886. There's this incredibly famous quote from Chekhov himself: "Medicine is my lawful wife, literature is my mistress." You see, Chekhov wasn't just a writer. He was an actively practicing medical doctor. And this biographical context is absolutely crucial. His background as a physician gave him this highly clinical, observant eye for human suffering and illness. Plus, his own grandfather was a former serf who literally had to purchase his family's freedom. That deeply grounded Chekhov's intimate understanding of the raw details of peasant life and the struggles of the rural underclass.
When we zoom out to look at the historical context, we absolutely have to talk about the Emancipation Reform of 1861. Yes, the serfs were legally freed by the Tsarist Empire, but there was a massive catch. They were given zero economic support. This created a huge, landless, and entirely destitute rural underclass. When we read A Day in the Country, this real-world historical event directly causes the sociocultural desperation we see on the page. It's perfectly reflected in the extreme, painful poverty of the main characters, the cobbler Terenti and the 2 young orphans, Fyokla and Danilka. Sure, they're technically free, but they are starving.
Socioculturally, Chekhov is using this story to explore the stark social disparities of his time. But, and this is key, rather than just despairing about it, he champions what we can call folk wisdom. In the story, Terenti the cobbler acts as the sort of organic teacher to the orphans, and the raw wilderness itself is their schoolbook. Chekhov uses this idea of communal empathy and deep connection to nature as a deliberate cultural antidote to the rapidly urbanizing, cold, and transactional Russian society that was completely ignoring people like Terenti.
Section 4. Analyzing London's Arctic Survival. Exploring the story of quiche. Let's move along and see how this builds, leaving the forests of rural Russia entirely behind. We're heading to a freezing Inuit village during the industrial era, starting with Jack London's biographical context. London's life was literally a grueling timeline of survival. He grew up in extreme poverty in San Francisco in the 1870s. By the 1890s, he was surviving brutal hard labor in canneries and mills. In 1897, he famously prospected in the freezing Klondike Gold Rush, which of course directly inspired his vivid Arctic settings. But crucially, in the 1900s, he really had to fight to rise as a self-made writer against a highly skeptical literary establishment. This personal, lifelong battle directly mirrors our young protagonist Quiche's struggle to prove himself to the deeply skeptical elders of his tribe.
Historically speaking, the story of Quiche was published in January 1904. This was the absolute peak of American industrialization and the rise of a concept known as social Darwinism, the idea of the survival of the fittest. London himself was an ardent socialist and activist. He was utterly fascinated by how raw, unforgiving nature forces individuals to adapt or perish. In his stories, he wanted to explore how scientific intellect and innovation could ultimately triumph over mere brute physical strength.
That historical fascination bleeds right into the sociocultural context of the story. Quiche's Inuit village is ruled by a gerontocracy, meaning authority is strictly held by the oldest, strongest physical hunters. Because of this societal rule, widows and orphans, like Quiche and his mother Aikaga, are completely marginalized and tossed only the poorest, oldest cuts of meat. But Quiche disrupts this entirely. He invents something he calls headcraft, using a compressed, sharp whalebone spring frozen inside a ball of seal blubber to safely and smartly hunt polar bears. This intellectual triumph over brute strength disrupts the traditional power structure, ultimately forcing the tribe to adopt democratic socialist principles where the marginalized are finally fed fairly.
Section 5. Comparing the two stories. How context dictates the narrative.
And this brilliantly illustrates the power of our methodology when we bring both investigations together. Look how vastly different contexts totally dictate the narrative. Chekhov, the doctor and grandson of a serf, writing post-Emancipation, focuses his story on communal empathy, shared poverty, and spiritual folk wisdom. On the flip side, Jack London, the self-made socialist who survived the brutal Klondike, focuses his story on individual scientific intellect overcoming the survival of the fittest and actively disrupting traditional hierarchies. You have two stories about poor, marginalized people, but they result in completely unique narratives, simply because of the author's distinct biographical, historical, and sociocultural realities.
Section 6. Viewer Discussion Guide. Becoming the Detective.
Well, we've done the heavy lifting, but now it's time to empower you to take the reins. Whether you're using this explainer in a classroom or just for your own independent learning, here are a few questions I really want you to sit with. First, how does knowing Chekhov's medical background actually change the way you visualize his specific descriptions of the starving orphans? Second, how does knowing Jack London's deep socialist beliefs alter how you interpret the ending where the tribe shares the meat equally? Third, think about today. What modern historical events happening right now do you think will shape the literature written a decade from now? And finally, the ultimate debate. Do you think a story can ever truly be separated from its author's biographical context?
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We've spent this explainer uncovering the specific contexts of Anton Chekhov and Jack London, but what about yours? Reading is a two-way street, after all. How does your own personal background, the history you are living through right now, and the societal rules you live by shape the way you understand these stories today? Keep being a literary detective, keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.